Thanks everyone for joining us here today. My name is Noam Segal, and on behalf of the chair, Stephen Henry Madoff, and myself, I'd like to welcome you to an MA Curatorial Practice event, Abuse of Power in AI Today, with Payton Croskey, Rebecca Stein, and Maithu Bui. I will read their bios in a second. I want to thank the panelists for joining me here today. I am very excited about this conversation. Speakers will present their research on AI security, touching on technological borders, bioluminescent landmine locators, and cybersecurity economic ties. As some of you know, in recent years, AI has been utilized for various security efforts, such as locating landmines at sea, but also monitoring and tracking down civilian populations. Abuse of power is all the more possible when the code is invisible. And part of the discussion will concern ways to address socially harmful uses of AI. So each of the speakers will present for about 15 minutes. And after that, we will have a brief chat and then we'll open to Q&A. Please feel free to drop your questions here in the Q&A box. The webinar is recorded and will be available later on at the MACP website. Now I'd like to introduce the wonderful speakers we have with us today, and after which I will hand it over to Maithu. So Maithu Bui is a German research activist and artist. Their research and work focuses on techno-ethics, warfare, ecolonialism, and virtual diasporas, as well as context sensitivity and belief systems. Maithu co-founded Curating Through Conflict with Care, CCC, and works at the German Informatics Society on AI, sustainability, and education. Payton Croskey is a visual artist and a tech justice scholar, designing liberatory tools at Princeton University. Creative content director and lead researcher of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, Payton research uncovers and develops ways of designing digital systems that protect and empower targeted communities. And last but not least, Rebecca Stein is a professor of cultural anthropology at Duke University and an award-winning teacher, researching the linkage between culture and politics in Israel and in the context of the Israeli military occupation and legacy of the Palestinian dispossession. She is the author and editor of 5 books in the field of anti-colonial Israel-Palestine studies. So again, thank you all for joining me today, and I will now mute myself and hand it over to Maithu. Thank you.
Thank you, Noam, for your kind introduction and invitation, allowing me to share my artistic research. I will read from my script, kind of. My new work is called Operation Violent Sweep. It's a sci-fi demining technology work on never-ending wars. So just a short overview over the content. I want to get started with the whys and whats on demining, then a very rough overview on demining technologies, demining presence, what does demining mean now, what kinds of weapons do we need to demine, and then my sci-fi futures on demining. It's a bit wild, but why not? So basically, the start of this whole work was my understanding of my family's history. And while I was working with my dad, my research began while my father would draw shapes of bombs he found but never touched. On his way to school, he remembered the bombings at night and the injuries that would follow. He would draw, make notes, and search images, references of fruits on the internet, because in Vietnamese language, these bombs would be named after fruits to decode the technical names of these explosives. For example, we see here pineapple bombs, a bomb that is called after a fruit in Vietnam. And this is a field with bomb craters in Cambodia. In the northern area of Vietnam, in the rice field, there you would see these round-shaped graves because of the Buddhist tradition and religion. And so I would trace back these round shapes that would repetitively show up in these areas through craters, bombs, ponds where, for example, my dad and my grandfather would fish some fish, and these graves where my families are being buried in front of their yards, and these landmines that look like these burials. And so while my dad, for example, was on his way to school, these plastics of bombs would be upcycled to cups for toothbrushing. One of his friends lost one of his finger while trying to play with this and to cut it off to basically upcycle it. And metals to cast objects for survival. For example, my dad, I will get into this later, but my dad showed me like 3 iron casted or aluminum casted pots from which his family would eat and with which he grew up. But these were casted by parts of metals that would fall down from the sky during the war. Basically, bombers, for example, the Stratoforce Fortress 52 and other planes. So during the war in Vietnam, the US used cluster bombs and airstrikes against targets in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. According to The Guardian, a very old article, of the 260 million cluster bomblets that rained down on Laos between 64 and 73, 80 million failed to detonate. And this whole work is basically named after and modified after the Operation End Sweep. That was a removal operation from the US. In 73, the operation fulfilled an American obligation under the Paris Peace Accord, with which the war ended. It also is the first operational deployment of a US Navy air mine countermeasure to take action against the never-ending wars. But the efforts are, fluctuating, they're diminishing and rising, like the floods. And this is also a big issue in Vietnam because due to the climate crisis that are haunting Vietnam since ever, these landmines are moving around the area, and it's hard for machine learning especially to track these down and to learn what kind of soil or how the ground looks like to basically track down these explosives visually. So the Landmine Monitor 2022 found that in 2020, for example, over 7,000 people died or got injured by these unexploded ordnances. In 2021, there were like over 5,500. And of course, these are numbers of people that, or reports that are participating in these monitors. The White House fact sheet that is usually being published by the White House on the website stated that they would provide 17.5 million for mine clearance. In comparison to a documentary I saw, if you would calculate the inflation, $44 billion of cluster munition were bombed down in Cambodia. Another issue they added to their mine action reports is the environmental policies that are being deployed, since demining is also an environmental issue. Toxins also get released into the soil, and also the technologies that's being developed are environmentally critical. One thing why I started this whole work was that the US basically announced its new landmine policy in January 2020, before the pandemic. And with their new landmine policy, they abandoned the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty and the 2014 directive that banned US production and acquisition of anti-personnel mines. The directive included a commitment not to assist, encourage, or cause other nations to use, stockpile, produce, or transfer anti-personnel mines. The Mine Ban Treaty bans anti-personnel mines, but not anti-vehicle mines, or mines that detonate on command, which is smart weapons remotely controlled. The 2020 policy allowed the US to develop, produce, and deploy landmines as long as they are non-persistent, which is equipped with self-destruct and self-deactivation capabilities, which are just a small number of all these landmines, because I will also get into the mass production of weapons that are nowadays more accessible and cheaper to produce, also through open source educational material, where even children are these days building drones to self-defend themselves. The Biden-Harris administration has reversed this in June 2022, but not fully, since they made a deal with the Republic of Korea to defend them on the Korean Peninsula. So the political and humanitarian costs are basically way too high, but also the demining cost. I call this ghost work because the work that is being deployed on demining are done by, these days, honeybees, through bioreporters. A rat even was named a hero in Cambodia, sniffing out landmines during his lifetime, and basically getting exported from Tanzania to Cambodia to sniff out landmines that humans basically dropped there. Of course, AI is being used, machine learning devices, experiments with AR, for example, is being done. How do we basically create machines that would detect landmines remotely, which also means that how do we learn to understand the soil and the surfaces to see whether there could be a mine or not? And then how do we sniff out through technology where these mines are? And basically the technology that is being used is also something that people either can build themselves. For example, an Afghan inventor built these balls that would hover around through with the wind on the land and then just tap on it so the exploded explosives would detonate themselves. I also rendered through Stable Diffusion or some AI generated text-to-image machine, some toy-like drones, because in Armenia, children are building drones to defend themselves against Azerbaijan. Drones are also being deployed by governments to detect mines. Robots are being built that look basically like harvesting machines. Also tanks, snake robots, robo-snakes are also being tested on these grounds, and everyone just wants to test the machines in Cambodia because there are so many of them to detect. Another group that has, another thing I was interested in was also whether or not we could not only remotely through machines, but through manipulation of genetics, find these toxins that are that you can find in the ground. And of course, if you search something on the internet, the probabilities are high that someone else already has done it. And so I found a research team in Hebrew University that recognized bacteria as cheap and expendable and capable of covering a lot of ground quickly. The team engineered E. coli bacteria to become landmine detectors or bioreporters, an idea Robert Burlich already tried to work on in the 90s in America and Tennessee. The E. coli are armed with luminescent genes from marine bacteria. In the presence of a chemical called DNT, the bacteria trigger these genes and emit their glow. A byproduct of TNT, DNT vapor leaches out into the soil around a landmine. The bacteria are encased in tiny beds, which provide all the food they need as they get to work. Beds used to encapsulate genetically engineered E. coli. When a laser beam hits them, those that have been near the gases emitted by a landmine will glow now. And bioluminescence is something that you find very often in nature. For example, in front of the harbor of Halong Bay, which also was bombed with naval mines. Basically, whenever these bioluminescent bacteria or living species would hit something, they would inevitably glow anyways. Also, researchers in Denmark created plants that change color in the presence of a landmine in 2004, and MIT scientists engineered spinach to detect landmines in 2016. Researchers on bioluminescent mushrooms are looking into how they can be used in areas contaminated with leftover ammunition landmines. Since these mushrooms live off phosphorus, they will glow in the dark once they have eaten the phosphorus, which is found in the ground around the landmines and ammunition. And coming back to the cycles of repetition, I just wanted to show you what I rendered in memory of what my grandmother has in her kitchen. These are basically, this is just a picture of a shortage of resources and poverty, but also in Japan during the World War II, people were making grenades out of pottery, or in pottery kind of workshops, they would build grenades because of shortage of metal. And so this is just a text to video rendering, since we are talking about AI, how AI would imagine these planes that were falling down from the sky to render into pods and drones that are these days being mass produced. A huge issue that we see now these days is cheap drones built in China or Turkey by Rokta, for example, is being made as accessible to mass people. And basically a lot of people, or whoever has money, can buy these drones that are built for mass destruction. And for example, drones that are being built in the US underlie certain guidelines, which are harder to be purchased, but these are these days more accessible. And everyone who learns coding or building machines basically is able to build a machine that can kill. This is nothing new, but the material that is, on the internet is accessible to all these people who have access to the internet, and thus accelerates the speed of which people can build machines, not only to defend themselves, but also to kill people. I mean, it's a dilemma now. And so I was imagining sci-fi futures in which biotechnology sadly takes over in a way that is also disruptive and invasive to these environments. And what will happen afterwards. For example, this is just an imagination of a dragon dance that we do during Lunar New Year. What would happen if a dragon, a mystical creature that is basically there, believed in to bring luck, bring so much luck that we would basically detect all these landmines or explosives, but also contaminate the soil for the future. And bioluminescent bees, what will happen to them, and all these robo snakes that are also being deployed in these areas. This is just a sneak peek from my previous work, where I'm talking about exploitation of resources and the wars on resources on the East Sea between China and all those other countries, for example, Vietnam, Philippines, and so on, through cabbage tactics and salami slicing. And this is just a preview to my new work, which is called Operation Biolum Sweep, where I imagine children on playgrounds where they have to wear bioluminescent suits that also calculate the approximate motions of these children to not touch upon the explosives from which bioluminescent giant mushrooms will grow as trees. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my talk. It was a bit chaotic, but I'm looking forward to Rebecca and Payton. So glad, thank you.
With that, we'll switch to Payton. And I'm gonna unmute myself again.
Hi all, thank you for joining me. Thank you again, Noam, for inviting me, and for my fellow panelists for joining me today. With that, yes, we can just jump right into things. So in response to the presentations that we've just were witness to, I'm really responding in a way of thinking about how are we able to imagine resistance to some of these technologies, whether it be the Israeli conflict, whether it be drones and just technology used to destroy and harm individuals. How can we imagine differently? How can we imagine liberatory tools and systems that do not do this and kind of go against that grain? That's really the focus of my talk today. But before all of that, I will give a quick introduction to myself again. I am Payton Croskey. I am currently calling in live from my dorm at Princeton University in the US. And I'm in my final year here studying African American studies and computer science. I'm really looking at that intersection of technology and humanity, how technology is affecting marginalized communities and how marginalized communities are fighting back. I'm also a visual artist, as are many of the people on this call today. I'm a dancer, and I'm also what I would call a music enthusiast. And so once again, as my fellow panelists have already done a thorough job of detailing the dangers of surveillance technology, especially when weaponized by military, government, and policing organizations. It's definitely clear that the non-consenting collection of data by way of airport security, facial recognition, street cameras, and the like are invading our rights and privacy. According to tech justice scholar Ruha Benjamin, our current systems simply reflect and reproduce existing inequities, while cosplaying as more objective or progressive than discriminatory systems of a previous era. These algorithms amplify racial hierarchies as designers encode their own biases into their projects. It's even known to be impossible to create something without some kind of intention or intended user in mind. That means that you cannot simply think about exactly what you're creating, but you also must think about the effects that it will have and how it was created in the first place. We must think about who created it and why. And as we've really come to understand today, it turns out the military is the intended user of today's most popular technology, from GPS to drones to the internet to even kites. Many of our commonplace tools were invented by and for the armed forces. These systems were originally soldiers at war and assistants in mass destruction. Although later adopted and adapted for civilian use, technology's birthplace was amidst an abundance of pain and violence. Hence, when these machines locate, attack, and kill their targets, they are functioning exactly as designed. So what now? It's clear that today's technology design process must be reconfigured from the ground up. The more that is uncovered about surveillance technology, the more I ask if there's any hope. Will tech always be this bad? Will our current or future technological tools ever enable us to outrun white supremacy? I, as a hopeful young person, say yes, but it's only if we think different than a dominant imagination, if we employ creativity to think about how we can create and think differently than what already exists in this world. So to find our answer, we must become acquainted with cultural theorists Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who advocate for the need to be in, but not of, the university. Now, this is a slight deviation from the topic of technology, but bear with me. They encourage study and creation within the undercommons, which stems from the belief that the university reproduces and reaffirms our culture's most dangerous systems. Thus, they push for the undercommons, an uninhibited space for the subversive intellectual to openly challenge cultural standards and plan for revolution. Essentially, the undercommons is a site for unfettered thought that reimagines and pushes for the destruction of the common, the comfortable, and the standard. And although Moten and Harney's detailing of the undercommons remains focused on emancipation from the university, there's room to expand this radical oasis to the realm of surveillance technology. And that extension is what I call the augmented undercommons. It's a domain where all who refuse to submit to technology's watchful eye may freely reside while reconfiguring the world's understanding of innovation and security. It is a revolutionary makerspace for targeted communities to create transformative tools rooted in liberation. And the instruments of the augmented undercommons challenge industry standards by offering new creative solutions. And to be clear here, the term augmented is referring to augmented reality, which describes the digital stimuli that appear as though it's in the real world. And thus the use of my term augmented is here to remind us that the undercommon still has ties to the common world, Unlike virtual reality, which is a fully immersive computer environment, augmented reality layers itself atop the physical realm. And the interaction with reality mirrors the inner commons because it responds to the world's stimuli before producing its own. Thus, attaching augmented to the undercommons also shines a spotlight on its most critical shortcoming. That is, because the undercommons is often reactive, it too is flawed by its intertwinement with the structures it seeks to abolish. The need to remain defensive limits its perspective beyond the enemy directly ahead. Yet it is all part of the process. To even access the undercommons, we must first learn to think and think differently than the commons. We must first know the commons. A virtual reality-esque world that allows for full, untainted immersion and liberation may come in time, but at this moment, we are embedded within the flawed land we inhabit now. And that's why the undercommons, augmented or not, is not the final destination. It's merely a transient place of learning. And as we learn and grow within the augmented undercommons, we are inventively crafting devices and spaces that represent the future we wish to see. And we invite us all to dismantle the worlds we cannot live without, even as we imagine the worlds we cannot live within, Professor Benjamin says again. They're subverting invasive algorithms, we're carving out our own virtual space and prioritizing communal wellness. So what exactly does this look like? One example is simple and requires no batteries or coding skills. Some seeking to oppose facial recognition have opted to paint their faces in creative yet strategic ways. One of these groups is known as Dazzle Club, and they're located in Australia. They apply colorful abstract lines and shapes to their skin to confuse and prevent cameras from detecting their face. And one thing that is notable about this particular technology is the way it doesn't look like our Western conceptions of tech. Although facial recognition algorithms may soon learn to avoid these efforts, this techno makeup expands our conceptions of technology and resistance to include things that don't have batteries or LED lights, that don't look like computers, phones, and the things that we've come to understand. The facial paint is actually a technology in itself, and it's very effective, actually. It's quite effective at confusing the facial recognition algorithms and leaving the person virtually shielded from those tools. And someone might wear this to a large protest, a targeted sit-in, or posting an informative video online where they want their identity to be shielded. Another one is these transforming jackets that Angela Luna created while at Parsons School of Design in the US. She essentially created multiple jackets that transform into functional necessities. One becomes a tent, another a sleeping bag. And these are all warm tools for those who are unhoused or traveling long distances without stable living arrangements. Particularly, Luna had refugees in mind when creating this project, allowing for people to travel long distances, where have physical warmth when they're traveling, but also have a place to sleep at the end of their day. And I also note that she's since created her company Adif, which focuses on design intervention for global issues. And again, I'll reiterate the fact that this technology, these tools, still look quite different than what we're used to. Again, it's not a phone, it's not a computer, but the jacket itself is a technology. It's a tool that can be used to protect and serve its users. And finally, there's also Brianna's Garden. It's an augmented reality app created in honor of Breonna Taylor, the 26-year-old EMT who spent time caring for patients and studying to become a nurse before her life was taken by US police. Created hand in hand with Taylor's family, this virtual app allows for communal grieving and relief. You can download it to your phone very easily. And once it's open, you receive a message from Taylor's sister, as her and her sister's selves are digitally drawn before you. Then flowers grow around you, allowing you to walk up to each one and hear a message left by someone around the world. And these messages may be someone reckoning with continued police violence or the loss of a loved one. It is ultimately a digital healing space that extends Taylor's life as a healer beyond this realm. So those are some examples of liberatory technology in action. But as previously mentioned, the final product is just as important as the values these tools are created with. That being said, here are some liberatory design principles that I have found important in my research. The first being to challenge the definition of technology. You see, marginalized communities have created and relied on different forms of tools and tech to survive for centuries. And just to be clear, here, each time I use the word technology, it is synonymous with the word for tool. Just like fire back in the caveman days, it is something that helps and aids humanity, something that serves its user. It does not have to look exactly like the tools we're used to today. And so when we expand our definition of technology to honor the rich histories and the creative ways that people have been employing tools throughout history, we might see how the quilts and braid patterns from formerly enslaved Africans actually represent a freedom technology that guided their paths to freedom, that guided their behaviors and sewed in messages into their hair, sewed messages into their quilts. These were all tools used by others. So we're able to expand our definition of technology, but we're also able to, think creatively and differently about what that might look like in the future. It does not have to be limited to the tools we see today. We also have to accept technology's limitations. Systemic problems require systemic change. Technology will never code away racism. It will never get rid of all of the problems we already have embedded in our humanity. It will take systemic change to really do that. So the problems we have today have existed long before our tech, and the communities fighting against these injustices have too. So we can use technology and tools as an aid, a way to address these harms, but the true change will always be systemic and societal. And also we need to be very intentional about what values we're encoding into our tools. We have to understand that, again, technology is never neutral. That means whatever your intention is behind what you're creating, it will come out in the final output. So creating a tool, as mentioned before, for the military, where it's used to be destructive, and then thinking it won't be destructive in other hands, is just false. It just won't happen. Next, we need to enter into study. It's a mode of thinking with others that is separate from the thinking the institution requires, separate from the thinking that your dominant society might require. It's studying the cracks within the tools that already exist, and also thinking differently about what we want to see next. We also must enact the first right, which is refusing the imposed dichotomy of being strictly for or against technology. Thinking that surveillance tech is the only option. We must think differently than that. We must challenge these conceptions and think, okay, what might happen if we get a bit more creative with our solutions? And next, we must refuse the call to order, again, thinking that the surveillance state is the only way. Finally, it means creating a community, working with and within affected groups, moving away from the individualistic mindset that often dominates. And it means taking our time, considering unintended consequences and ethical implications prior to releasing new tools. Essentially, the Augmented Undercommons is a network of creatives, designers, artists who uncover and design their own liberation from our digital society. Their refusal to click, snap, and send their data is as much a strategy as their decision to participate in a virtual realm of their own. They silence the sound of the machines to reconsider the need for its presence. They mute their voices and blur their faces, searching for their true identities. But most importantly, they dream of their revolutionary future as they create under the commons. And this process of building a rocket beneath ground before seeing it flying through the sky reminds us all that we must go low before we can go high. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Payton. So wow, there's a lot to unpack here. I want to ask you all about the invisibility of those weapons and tools and technologies. Do you think there is any, as Maithu, you suggested that basically kids can produce their own drones today as a method of resistance? And maybe we can tie that to how we can talk about resistance, and of course to tap to Payton's presentation that providing these tools. And I wonder, like, some of them are actually usable in that geography, for example, but maybe you can say more about other tools that can be utilized in such situations. So whoever wants to start.
Because I'm working at the German Informatics Society, what we sometimes do is also we have educational programs. And last year we did Hack the Summer, which is educational programs for students in school, in which they can, through mentors, develop their ideas into prototypes. And a lot of people, because we live in Berlin, Germany, and there were students all around Germany as well. It's a predominantly white area, of course. It was more about sustainable action, meaning upcycling. So when I first saw this short documentary in Armenian Report, where students would build their drones in hopes to defend themselves against Azerbaijan, I was like, yeah, basically this would have been something if my parents would have access to back then, because Vietnam is known as a huge experimental field, as Rebecca said, like warfare areas are there to experiment. And all these toxins, the chemical weapons that were used in the Vietnam War was a huge experiment. And thankfully so, for a lot of scientists these days, the war never ended. And also in Cambodia, a lot of scientists are hoping to test their drones, test their machine learning in these areas to demine. These experimental fields are still there. And so children are these days more equipped than my parents back then, in hope if they have access to, of course, I mean, through the energy crisis, we know if there's energy shortage, there's no access to information. But if you have these information circulating around in like toolboxes that were shared on the internet, in Twitter, for example, environmental groups would share their toolboxes, how to work towards environmental goals. I believe there's something like this circulating around the internet as well, how to self-defend yourself as well.
Payton, would love to hear.
Yes, I'll add to that we see digital resistance happening in many ways, and one of the ways is kind of what we've been describing now, which is, you know, taking a tool that was previously used to harm an individual and then turning it back on those users. And so taking a drone and then using it against those who employed it in the first place, or using facial recognition to spot and find certain ICE workers in the US who have been kind of abusing immigrants, things of that nature, kind of taking the tools that are already being used to harm and then just kind of changing that narration. And there's also the, you know, twofold, another lens that people take, which is making something entirely different, which is, you know, kind of like the face painting, even as an example, the transforming jackets, taking something that has no roots or no ties to the original technology that it's trying to avoid and creating something differently. And I think both are very important, you know, because, you know, currently we exist in a world where we all have, you know, these phones, these computers, these tools that these social media sites, whatever it might be, that are very harmful and destructive, but we still, you know, kind of need an immediate, like, how can I use this in a way that is more liberatory than intended or I once used, but also, you know, thinking about where we can go in the future, thinking about how we might make something completely different that is much more creative and imaginative than simply taking the things that we already have and then slightly tweaking them, because ultimately that is only a temporary fix. What we really need is a big push or a real change in the way that we think about these things.
And just a question, just to say, everyone who wants to ask questions, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. But just to follow up on that, are there any open codes available for developing those kind of tools for the people, I mean, not for states?
Yes, so actually in a research group with the IWL's Data Lab in the US, I led a team that was looking for liberatory technology that already exists and kind of ways of thinking about new ones. And I'm not sure that I can specifically drop the link, but there is a GitHub repository. If anyone's familiar with GitHub, it's a site that many coders kind of use to share information, to learn new things. And there is, if you look up liberatory technology and digital marionage, there is a GitHub repository that kind of houses many liberatory tools. And what we did during that project was we both looked at the tools that already exist, the ways that people are thinking about these things, and kind of housed them all in one place. But we also kind of inspected them and said, what are the pros and cons of this? What are the benefits? Where does it fall short? How might we change this? Or what is a tool that somebody thought was liberatory, but like, for instance, there were, baby fingerprint scanners to make sure that a baby never gets passed over to the wrong mother, but then that baby ends up being in the system, in the police system for the rest of their lives. And so that was a tool that was intended to be liberatory, but ended up having a much more harmful effect. And so that's also included in this kind of digital toolbox that we've crafted, where you can kind of explore for yourself what already exists, and then also how people are thinking of continuing that. And again, it's on GitHub. It's the Liberatory Technology and Digital Marriage repository.
Thank you so much. And Maithu and Payton, as a last thing, can you tell a bit about how you also, if you integrate those tools into your artistic practice? Maithu, of course, you're one of the founders of Curating Conflict with Care, and of course, Payton, as you mentioned, you have your own individual practice as an artist and both as a researcher. So I just wonder if you have final words for artists and curators, how to deal with those tools and how it is really possible to integrate them into our day-to-day practices.
One main idea is, if I may start, is missing data inside these institutions and these spaces. I mean, Payton already said, how do we resist to invent new things? I also believe that we can look upon indigenous tactics and strategies that have been overlooked or not been usage for all these governments or institutional structures that hold power. But I believe that there's a lot of things that you don't need to invent, but need to adapt to apply to the new technologies we already have, because AI is doing the same, right? And I think what's happening is that humans become the other part of AI. We also become AI, we become more mechanic. How we are being tracked or how we're being surveilled is becoming information. And so we're becoming information as well, and we're becoming machines as well as the AIs are becoming more humans, because an AI becomes a better human the more the human becomes a machine. So this is just what I have to say about this. When we think about curating, that we have to keep this in mind as well, not to become machines.
And I'll say I take a bit of a different approach to my kind of artistic practice and weaving in my research. On one hand, a big part of my discussion of the augmented undercommons and thinking about liberatory tools is fostering the imagination and creativity. And so kind of my research and my artistic practice kind of go hand in hand, because in order to imagine, new worlds that aren't reliant on drones, that aren't reliant on military technology and tools, we need to be able to imagine it. We need to foster that imagination. We need to be engaging in artistic practice. So whether it be painting, whether it be graphic design, my quilting as something I've just recently started doing, crocheting, whatever it is, whatever your artistic form is, it's allowing you to kind of start, working and exercising that muscle and getting your brain used to thinking differently, reading sci-fi novels, engaging with the various forms of art that exist out there are kind of the first step in us kind of creating something different, or even being able to look at a tool that has been used to harm you previously, and then knowing, how can I actually alter that and change it and make it something beautiful instead? That takes creativity. And so that's really how it's ingrained in my artistic practice.
Thank you, all of you. You've been wonderful, and I'm so happy you could join me, and I learned a lot. And thank the audience, and thanks the department here, and I'll see you next time on our next event.